Chapter 2. Road to Chernobyl. On the evening of March 6, 1986, as the invigorated Mikhail Gorbachev hosted a reception in the Kremlin Palace for the foreign guests of the Congress, most of them representatives of communist parties who had come to Moscow at Soviet expense, the Soviet delegates were leaving Moscow on planes, trains and cars. Viktor Brukhanov and his fellow members of the Kiev delegation boarded a night train to Ukraine's capital. The next morning they were in Kiev, where they were greeted by local party officials. There were hugs, handshakes and flowers for the women in the delegation. The next day, Saturday, March the 8th, was International Women's Day, widely celebrated in the Soviet Union. A news photo taken at the main Kiev railway station on the morning of March the 7th featured Brukhanov in his fur hat and sheepskin coat, surrounded by fellow delegates, one of them a woman holding a bouquet of carnations. Brukhanov would have to get flowers for his wife Valentina, but the drive home would take more than 2 hours. The distance between Kiev and Pripyat was 150 kilometers. The driver of Brukhanov's company car came to meet him at the railway station and took Moscow Avenue to Highway PO2. It led north of Kiev along the Dnieper Reservoir, which had been created by the hydroelectric power station built there in the 1960s, then turned northeast toward the town of Ivankiv, passing through birch groves and, closer to Chernobyl, entering a zone of pine forests. Brukhanov had first travelled the Kiev-Pripyat highway by bus in the winter of 1970, when the city of Pripyat did not yet exist. He was young and full of enthusiasm. Becoming director of a nuclear power plant at such an age was quite an accomplishment, but for a while there had been no plant to talk about. Brukhanov had yet to build it. The plant, his own offices, along with a home for his family, which included his wife Valentina, their 9-year-old daughter, Lilia, and 1-year-old son, Oleg. He rented a room in a run-down hotel in the small town of Chornobyl, in Russian, Chernobyl, which would give its name to the power station Brukhanov yet had to build. He spread out the papers on his bed and began working through draft construction plans and contracts for the first temporary buildings on the spot chosen for the new plant and the new city. Construction would begin in a year. Meanwhile, Brukhanov's young family stayed in Sloviansk, then a city of 125,000 in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, where he had worked previously. The city would become known in 2014 as the place where the Russo-Ukrainian armed conflict began, and the first people were killed. The fighting was so fierce there because Sloviansk was the local highway and railway hub, as well as a major industrial centre. That was why Brukhanov had ended up there in 1966. He had worked at a power plant that produced electrical energy by burning local coal. Brukhanov's first power plant was in Angren, not too far from Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, where he had been born on December 1st, 1935. He was the oldest child in a large Russian working-class family that had come to the city from Saratov on the Volga. He did not remember much from the World War II years except that he was always hungry. At the age of 24, he graduated from the local Polytechnic Institute and began his career at nearby Angren. It was there that he met Valentina, who also worked at the plant. In addition, she took evening classes at the local college. He was captivated by her eyes. As he remembered later, he felt that he could drown in them. When Valentina first encountered Viktor's surname in a local magazine, he was already making headlines as a qualified and conscientious engineer. He had become head of his unit in just 1 year, and Valentina thought to herself, God forbid having such a name. Brukhanov was either derived from or was simply consonant with the Russian word for belly. She would soon forget her worries after meeting the bearer of the name, the young, slim and energetic Viktor. He won her heart, showing his love by inundating her with flowers. Cars coming from the nearby Kurama Mountains brought wild tulips, and Viktor would bring home enough to cover entire windowsills. They got married in a year, and were very happy in Angren. The Brukhanovs' tulip paradise came to an end early on the morning of April the 26th, 1966, 20 years to the day before the Chernobyl catastrophe. On that Tuesday, a powerful earthquake destroyed most of downtown Tashkent, Brukhanov's hometown, located 112 kilometers from Angren. More than 230 administrative buildings and over 700 shops and cafeterias were either completely destroyed or rendered unusable. Miraculously, only 8 people died as a result of the earthquake, but many more were injured, and close to 300,000, almost 1/3 of the city's population, woke up without a roof above their heads. Among them were Brukhanov's parents, whose brick home was badly cracked and on the verge of collapsing. For Valentina Brukhanova, it was too much to take. What if another earthquake devastated Angren as it had Tashkent? What would happen to them and their young daughter? She wanted the family to move. Encouraged by his wife, Viktor began making inquiries at power plants in other parts of the Soviet Union. It turned out that they were looking for people just like him in Ukraine. The Brukhanovs packed their bags and went to Sloviansk, where Viktor soon rose through the ranks to become chief of the turbine division and then chief engineer of the plant. The Sloviansk plant was still growing when the Brukhanovs arrived in 1966. A new unit, the largest in the Soviet Union, as Viktor later recalled, was under construction. He embraced the challenge and soon showed himself a capable engineer and organizer once again. The start-up phase for new units was especially challenging, but Brukhanov managed the stress with aplomb, dealing simultaneously with construction crews that missed critically important deadlines and electricity production quotas. A hard-working, competent and calm man of few words, Brukhanov seemed to have been born for such situations. That got him noticed in Kiev, and in the spring of 1970 he was offered a job that would require the kind of qualities he had shown in Sloviansk, but on a much larger scale. The authorities wanted to put him in charge of the construction and then the operation of a new power plant to be built in the environs of Chernobyl, far away from the coal fields of either Uzbekistan or Ukraine. The new plant did not need coal. It would run on nuclear fuel instead. It was a difficult decision for the young engineer. He asked Valentina for advice. She was afraid. It was a nuclear power plant, after all, and Viktor was a turbine specialist who knew nothing about reactors and nuclear power. But a power plant was a power plant, they told him in Kiev. The superiors in Moscow agreed. There were few nuclear engineers available to build plants when the nuclear energy industry was just getting on its feet. Brukhanov accepted the challenge. But before becoming an expert in nuclear energy, he would have to become well versed in construction, a difficult task and initially a thankless job. He would regret his choice at first, but change his mind later. "I regret nothing," he would tell a correspondent on the eve of his 50th birthday in December 1985. There were even fewer reasons to regret anything in March 1986, when Brukhanov returned from the party congress in Moscow and got into his company car at the Kiev railway station to drive back home to Pripyat. The Kiev-Pripyat highway was a narrow 2-lane road with a large amount of traffic. Both the nuclear power plant and the satellite city depended on it for many of their supplies. Brukhanov's driver knew the Kiev-Pripyat road almost by heart. His boss was constantly going back and forth between the two cities. Party bosses, ministers and heads of departments were all in Kiev, and the director had to travel there for numerous meetings. Then there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of permits and other documents that needed signatures and stamps that could be obtained only in Kiev. After a drive of almost 2 hours through forested countryside still covered with snow, Brukhanov's car finally approached Chernobyl. On the left was a concrete structure with the name of a city and a monument to Vladimir Lenin. Ahead was a central square that was rather large for a town that did not exceed 14,000 inhabitants. Despite the construction of the nuclear power plant and the rapidly growing city of Pripyat, a dozen kilometers to the north, Chernobyl had managed to stay almost the same as it had been 10, 20, or even 30 years before it gave its name to the plant. While Pripyat had become a symbol of the industrialized socialist future, Chernobyl remained an embodiment of the rural pre-socialist past. The city on the Pripyat River and the port that had provided livelihoods for generations of its inhabitants featured numerous buildings dating to pre-Soviet times. The settlement of Chernobyl was first mentioned in a Kievan chronicle in 1193. It stood on the hunting grounds of the Kievan princes, who ruled a vast medieval realm extending from the Carpathians in the west to the Volga towns in the east. The chronicle never explained the origins of the town's name, but scholars would eventually point to an abundance of common wormwood, or Artemisia vulgaris, a shrub recognizable by the black or dark red color of its branches. Chorny is the Ukrainian word for black. Thus, the shrub gave its name to Chernobyl, or Chernobyl, allowing future generations to associate the Chernobyl catastrophe with the biblical prophecy about a star called Wormwood. The third angel sounded his trumpet, reads the book of Revelation, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The common wormwood, after which the town of Chernobyl was named, is not exactly the same shrub as the wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, mentioned in the Bible, but it was close enough for many, including President Ronald Reagan, to conclude that the Chernobyl accident was prophesied in the Bible. The biblical prophecy aside, Chernobyl remained the capital of the North Ukrainian wilderness for most of its history. In early modern times, the rule of Kievan princes over the region was replaced by that of Lithuanian Grand Dukes, and then of Polish kings. The Cossacks claimed the territory in the mid-17th century, but after a few years they had to cede it to the Poles. The town became the private property of local nobles and magnates. Mainstream history has forgotten most of Chernobyl's rulers and residents, with the exception of one young woman, Rosalia Lubomirska, a daughter of the town's owner, who had the misfortune of travelling to Paris at the time of the French Revolution. Maximilien de Robespierre put her on trial for close ties with the royals and alleged conspiracy against the revolution. Rosalia died on the guillotine in the French capital in June 1794. She was 26 years old. Her image survived on a wall tile in her old Chernobyl palace, which was later turned into a neurology ward of the local hospital. Whereas the French Revolution killed Chernobyl's internationally best-known citizen, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 did away with much of the town's rank and file. Some 60% of the town's population of 10,000 were Orthodox Jews, first invited there in the late 17th century by its Polish owners. Before the revolution, Chernobyl acquired a reputation as one of the centers of Hasidism in Ukraine. The spiritual leaders of the Chernobyl Jews were rabbis of the Hasidic dynasty, established in the second half of the 18th century by Rabbi Menachem Nachum Tversky, a student of Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, who was himself one of the pioneers of the movement. Rabbi Tversky's book, Meor Einayim, Light of One's Eyes, became a classic Hasidic text, and his sons and grandsons became rabbis in numerous towns of Ukraine. The Chernobyl rabbis were famous for collecting money for charitable causes. In the early 20th century, there were a number of Jewish prayer houses, a school for Jewish girls, and an asylum in Chernobyl. The Jews of Chernobyl suffered disproportionately at the time of the revolution and the civil war that followed it, not only from passing military units, but also from marauding gangs, the members of which were often recruited by local warlords from the area's Ukrainian and Belarusian villages. Quite a few local Jewish youths had sided with the Bolsheviks, the political and military force that turned out to be the most friendly toward the poor Jewish masses, and offered them the shortest path to emancipation. One of the leaders of the revolutionary transformation, Stalin's right-hand man, Lazar Kaganovich, came from the Chernobyl region. In the mid-1920s, Kaganovich became the communist boss of Ukraine and presided over the policy of Korenizatsiya, or indigenization, which put a temporary halt to the cultural Russification of the local population and promoted the development of Ukrainian and Jewish culture. As Stalin's policies changed, however, so did the role that Kaganovich played in Ukraine. In the early 1930s, he became one of the main architects of the Holodomor, the great Ukrainian famine that took the lives of close to 4 million survivors of the revolution and the civil war, and of the children that had been born to them in the years that followed. Some 1 million people died in the Kiev region alone. In Kaganovich's native district of Khabne, the death toll was 168 individuals per 1,000. The area was more than decimated. Tens of thousands did not survive the famine and lived to see the renaming of Khabne to Kaganovichi I and the village of Kabani, where the party boss was born in 1893, to Kaganovichi II in 1934, probably in recognition of the native son's loyalty not to his homeland, but to his boss in the Kremlin. Then came the horrors of World War II. The Germans entered Chernobyl on August the 25th, 1941. Less than 3 months later, on November the 19th, the occupation authorities ordered the approximately 400 Jews still remaining in the town to gather near the synagogue. They were then marched to the premises of a Jewish collective farm called New World. There they were gunned down by automatic fire in the anti-tank ravine that some of them had helped dig as part of a futile effort by the Red Army commanders to stop the invaders. That was almost the end of the Jewish community of Chernobyl. By the time Brukhanov rented a hotel room there in the winter of 1970, there were only 150 Jewish families in the town where Jews had once been the majority. One of their synagogues had been turned into the headquarters of the local military commissariat. The Chernobyl Jews who survived the Holocaust found refuge with partisan units in the surrounding forests. The communist-organized guerrilla groups which enlisted local Ukrainian and Belarusian peasants were active in the region from the fall of 1941. But the low-intensity war between the communist-backed partisans and the German-organized police, including local cadres, turned into a bloody vendetta. The executions of partisans and, once the tide of the war turned, of policemen took place in public, further brutalizing the local population. The settling of accounts among the relatives of those involved in the conflict would continue long after the end of the war. The Red Army captured Chernobyl and its environs from the Germans in the fall of 1943. It was a long and bloody battle. At stake was Chernobyl's port on the Pripyat River, the hub of the city's economic activity, as well as the bridges over the river and the nearby railway station. The Red Army suffered enormous casualties. It lost 10 of its bravest, soldiers and officers decorated with the country's highest award, Hero of the Soviet Union. For the locals, the long-awaited liberation from the Nazis brought more death and hardship. With the Red Army in control of the region, the local male population was immediately called up and enlisted in the army. Many of those who survived the occupation were thrown into battle without arms, training, or even uniforms, dying on the outskirts of their villages and towns. As Brukhanov's car passed the Chernobyl city limits, he recognized a familiar silhouette on the right side of the road. It was the statue of a Soviet soldier memorializing natives of the village of Kupachi who had died in the war, and Red Army soldiers who had died in battle for the village in 1943. The first list was significantly longer than the second. In Chernobyl, the soldiers who had died in the 6-week battle for the town were buried in a place that later became known as the Park of Glory. Its alley of heroes led up to an obelisk with an eternal flame at its base. To the warrior liberators from the working masses of the Chernobyl district, May 1977, reads the inscription on one of the monuments in the park. Next to the inscriptions are plaques with names of Red Army generals and the units they led in the battle for the town. Over the years, Bryukhanov had attended quite a few commemoration ceremonies at the Chernobyl Park of Glory on May the 9th, Soviet Victory Day. The cult of heroes of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviet-German conflict of 1941 to 1945 became known in Soviet parlance, commemorated only those who had died wearing the Red Army uniform. The rest were largely forgotten. There would be no monuments to victims of the Holocaust or of the Holodomor. Both atrocities went unacknowledged. A few minutes after the director's car passed the monument to the war heroes, Bryukhanov could already see the huge white tube of the Chernobyl plant's cooling tower on the horizon. There, according to the official Soviet narrative, the shadows of the past were lifting. The miracle of technological progress was about to deliver a bright future. To the right of the canal that the car was following, there appeared the walls of Unit 5, which was still under construction and surrounded by tall, powerful cranes. Then the white walls of the operating units came into view. Units 3 and 4 were joined together in one huge building. Units 1 and 2 were separate. The area near the village of Kopachy had been chosen as the construction site of the nuclear plant in December 1966. The search for the right place had begun a year before that, with a memo from the deputy head of the Ukrainian government, Oleksandr Shcherban, to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine, CPU. A former vice president of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences and an early enthusiast of nuclear energy, Shcherban had decried the lack of electrical power-generating facilities in Ukraine, predicting a possible slowdown of the republic's economic development if new sources of energy were not found promptly. Shcherban knew that 2 nuclear power stations had been launched in Russia in 1964 and advocated the construction of 3 such stations in Ukraine, one in the south, another in the west, and a third in the area around Kiev. He was soon backed by his superior, the head of the Ukrainian government, Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, and Shcherbitsky's boss, the first secretary of the CPU, Petro Shelest, who was also a member of the All-Union Politburo. Shelest wrote to Moscow demanding that Shcherban's proposal be included in the Union's plans for the construction of new nuclear power stations. In response, the Union government approved the building of 1 nuclear power plant in Ukraine. Kiev was not unduly disappointed by the reduction in the number of plants. The important thing was that the Republic was getting on the nuclear bandwagon and acquiring what was then considered cutting-edge technology. In the fall of 1966, Volodymyr Shcherbitsky issued a decree ordering the start of the exploratory work for the construction of what was then known as the Central Ukrainian Nuclear Power Plant. The commission, formed in Kiev in November of that year, soon concluded that there was no better place to build the plant than the area near Kopachy. It was a fairly large settlement with more than 1,000 inhabitants, but surrounded by a sparsely populated area. The village was distant enough from big cities and towns as well as from the resort areas. Another site was turned down because it was too close to such an area. It was also close to the Pripyat River, which was essential for the functioning of a nuclear plant, but its location was not a marshland. No less important was the site's proximity to a railway station. The railway had been built during the first Soviet 5-year plan. Its construction began under the Chernobyl area's native son, Lazar Kaganovich. True, there were also some problems with the location. Underground waters were coming too close to the surface, and a great deal of soil would have to be brought in to ensure a solid foundation for the buildings. Kopachy was distant from sources of construction materials, including rocks and granite. Only sand was available locally, but the surveyors considered those problems manageable. Because the area was not very agriculturally productive, converting it to an industrial site would have little impact on the rural economy. The future plant's cooling pond, the reservoir needed for the functioning of the plant, would take up the biggest chunk of the territory allocated for the construction of the plant and the satellite city, altogether more than 1,400 hectares, or 3,460 acres, of pasture land, 130 hectares, or 320 acres, of forest, 96 hectares, or 240 acres, of cultivated land, and 50 hectares, or 120 acres, of gardens planted by the local population. Copaci was ruled to be the best of the 16 locations considered by the Commission. The name of the facility was eventually changed from the central Ukrainian plant to the Chernobyl plant. The center had moved north to the very border with Belarus. There is no indication that the Belarusians were ever consulted. The construction of the plant began on Brukhanov's watch. In the summer of 1970, he moved his headquarters from the rented hotel room to an office of less than 6 square meters in a mobile construction workers' barrack. From there, he commanded his growing cohort of engineers, checked on the construction crews, and visited high offices in Kiev and Moscow. Grigory Medvedev, who came to the Chernobyl plant in the winter of 1971 to take the position of a deputy chief engineer, had idyllic memories of Chernobyl at the start of construction. There was a sparse forest of young pines all around, with an intoxicating atmosphere unmatched anywhere else. There were sand hills covered with a low-growth forest, and patches of pure yellow sand against a background of deep green moss. No snow to be seen. Green grass warmed by the sun dotted the area, silence, and a sense of primeval creation. The silence did not last very long. Excavators working around the clock soon removed some 700,000 cubic meters of soil for the foundations of the new unit. In August 1972, Petro Neporoshny, the all-Union Minister of Energy and Electrification, visited the site himself to witness the first pouring of concrete. Speeches were delivered and pledges made, but it would take much longer than the authorities expected to complete construction and make the reactor operational. It was supposed to be up and running in 1975, but there were problems with the supply of reactor parts and related equipment. In April 1975, with the original deadline all but missed, Volodymyr Shcherbitsky, who had been promoted from head of government to party boss of Ukraine, appealed directly to Moscow. Things finally started moving, and the requisite equipment arrived. In August 1977, the first nuclear fuel was loaded into the core of the reactor. In September, it began operation and was connected to the grid, and in December, Brukhanov signed the documents declaring the reactor fully operational. It was only then that Brukhanov made the transition from director, mainly responsible for the construction of the plant, to director predominantly responsible for its operation. The year 1977 will go down in the history of Soviet atomic energy as the year of the birth of an energy giant on the Pripyat. He wrote with satisfaction in one of Ukraine's leading newspapers at the end of the year. A new era had indeed begun. In December 1978, Unit 2 was connected to the grid. 3 years later, in December 1981, Unit 3 produced its first electricity, and Unit 4 followed in December 1983. The December dates of completion of units or their connection to the grid were not coincidental. The pressure to launch reactors before the end of a given year was enormous. Party leaders and ministry officials wanted to present achievements in their annual reports, while construction crews and operational personnel would not get their hefty bonuses if they did not complete planned tasks by year's end. Interestingly enough, no one could speak aloud of the impossibility of going on stream in a given year until December 31st, recalled Anatoly Dyatlov, a nuclear engineer who first arrived in Pripyat in 1972. None of the units were completed on time. Upon his arrival, Dyatlov noticed a slogan above the entrance to the dining hall calling on construction workers and engineers to launch the first reactor in 1975. As 1975 passed without a working reactor, they changed 5 to 6 and then to 7. Every year representatives from the ministry would come and insist on a new unrealistic date that everyone knew could not be fulfilled. And at first there would be jitters because of strict insistence on fulfillment of a timetable that was incapable of fulfillment from the moment of its creation, remembered Dyatlov. Tough production meetings and summons to work at night. Delays inevitably increased, vigilance fell off, and normal work began, until the supervisor's next visit. Brukhanov vividly remembered the launch of every successive unit. He was often critical of the construction crews. At a meeting of the party committee for the city of Pripyat, he chastised them, saying, "Incompetence in production, that is, in the plant workshops, makes itself felt on construction sites in poor quality parts and poor work. Take something as simple as calculating corners, crooked openings for doors and windows, crookedly nailed finishing elements, wrong angles in the installation of plumbing." Brukhanov was in a difficult position. He was the one who had to sign papers attesting to the satisfactory completion of the work. The bosses, for their part, wanted to report the fulfillment of plans, and the construction workers wanted their bonuses. But Brukhanov was responsible for the operational soundness and safety of the units. The problem was that the government was at once contractor and client. The plant and the construction directorate both reported to the same bosses at party headquarters in Kiev and Moscow. If Brukhanov complained too much about problems with the work done by the construction directorate, he could easily lose his job. Finally, Brukhanov's car approached Pripyat, the city that had been built before his own eyes and with his active participation. Sometimes he thought he had had enough of the place. He would feel tired and want to try something else. They had asked him in Moscow whether he would be interested in going abroad, for example, to help build a nuclear power plant in Cuba, where Soviet architects and engineers had begun construction of the country's first nuclear reactor in 1983. But those were moments of weakness. Brukhanov stayed in Pripyat. The city was only 3.5 kilometers north of the power plant. The road from the station turned into Pripyat's main street, the broad Lenin Boulevard, with trees and flowers planted in the median between the wide lanes leading to the town's main square. Located there were the administrative building, housing party headquarters, and the city hall, the Palace of Culture called the Energy Worker, and the hotel named Polisia, meaning forested area, a reference to the huge ecological region covering most of northern Ukraine from the Dnieper in the east to the Polish border in the west. The main square was at the intersection of the city's two main boulevards, one named after Lenin and the other, perpendicular to it, after the founder of the Soviet nuclear program, Igor Kurchatov. On the corner of the two boulevards, facing the square, stood the town's White House, a 9-story apartment building that housed the city's elite. Brukhanov's apartment was on the 4th floor. It was his second home in Pripyat. The first was located farther down Lenin Boulevard, in the first apartment building to be built in Pripyat in 1971. Back then he had needed permission from a party secretary in Kiev to move in. So scarce was housing in the city during its first years of existence, and so careful was the party not to offend the working class by creating the impression that it favoured managers over workers when it came to goods and privileges. The new town was supposed to be an embodiment of socialism, with no private cottages allowed. The planners projected that by 1975 it would house close to 12,000 plant and construction workers. By 1980, as the third and fourth reactors were to come on stream, the number of people dwelling in the city was expected to grow to 18,000. The population would then decline to slightly more than 17,000 and stay at about that level for the next 5 years. In fact, Pripyat grew much faster, attaining a population of almost 50,000 by 1986. Housing remained a problem. The leaders of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League, the youth branch of the Communist Party, had given the city of Pripyat and the Chernobyl power plant the status of a Komsomol construction site, recruiting young people all over the Soviet Union to join its workforce. But most of those who came to work in Pripyat needed no special encouragement. Problems with housing were common in Soviet cities, and in Pripyat housing was being built faster and better than anywhere else. The city enjoyed special status in the country and the Republic with regard to supply of consumer goods and agricultural products, because the nuclear industry was still very close to the military-industrial complex with its special privileges. By the mid-1980s, it had become impossible to buy cheese or sausage in most of the towns and big cities of the Soviet Union, but those products were freely available in Pripyat. The signs in the local supermarket did not lie in that regard. More difficult was the situation with fresh meat, which was often supplemented with lard and bones, but then at least there were villages around the town where meat and milk could be bought. Life was relatively good in Pripyat, and many, especially from the neighbouring villages, wanted to move there. Once in the city, often as construction workers, they all wanted to work at the nuclear plant, where bonuses could be earned for fulfilling and over-fulfilling production quotas. Most people who came to the new city were young, and many were unmarried. The average age of those living in Pripyat in 1986 was 26. There were 18 dormitories in the city for singles, and most apartments were designed for young families. Not only were most inhabitants young, but their children, when they had them, were young as well. In the 5 local elementary schools there were as many as 15 parallel classes, each with no fewer than 30 students. Most rural schools, by contrast, had barely enough students for one class. In most urban schools there were only 3 parallel classes running at most, and there was no sign of this trend slowing. More than 1,000 newborns were welcomed to the city every year. There were 2 stadiums and 2 swimming pools, one of which qualified for international competitions. Brukhanov was proud of what he had helped to build in the city, but also annoyed that he often had to divert funds and resources from the plant for construction projects in Pripyat. The city was run separately from the plant by the party and local authorities, but as the city's coffers were often empty, while the power plant had an enormous budget, the local party authorities kept importuning Brukhanov to chip in and build new facilities for the city. Brukhanov could keep the local party bosses at bay, but he could not say no to the party officials on the regional and republican levels. They outranked him in the party-state hierarchy. Especially pushy was the first secretary of the Kiev Regional Party Committee, Grigory Revenko, who would become Gorbachev's chief of staff in 1991. In the mid-1980s, Revenko convinced Brukhanov to build the second swimming pool, which would meet international standards. Then he came up with plans for a skating rink. Brukhanov bristled at this. There was nothing of that class in all of Ukraine, but I was supposed to build it in my little town, he recalled later. Still, he went along with the request. Brukhanov realized that his own workers needed sports facilities and would benefit from them. The same was true of the shops, as the architects had planned for only one supermarket. The city needed more, and Brukhanov found money for them, occasionally misleading the banks. He would borrow funds for the plant and spend them on the city. We get used to the abnormal and begin to accept it as something like the norm. That is what's so terrible, he complained to a reporter a few months before the party congress in Moscow, referring to the need to take care of the city's problems when his time and energy were needed at the plant, to ensure its safety, among other things. In those second-rate circumstances, the main thing is to ensure the reliability and safety of our work, said Brukhanov, continuing his litany of complaints. Whatever you say, we are no ordinary enterprise. God forbid that we suffer any serious mishap. I'm afraid that not only Ukraine, but the Union as a whole would not be able to deal with such a disaster. But for now, Brukhanov could put such disturbing thoughts aside. He was finally home. International Women's Day lay ahead, a chance to greet his wife and spend time with friends and colleagues. His daughter no longer lived with them. She and her husband were about to graduate from medical school in Kiev. The Brukhanovs would have to greet her over the phone, but they soon hoped to host the young couple in Pripyat. They were expecting a child, and Brukhanov would become a grandfather. He had worked hard for everything that he had achieved in life, but he had to admit that life was treating him pretty well. The year 1986 seemed to be off to a particularly good start. First, there was his participation in the party congress in Moscow. Then there were rumours that he was poised to be awarded the star of Hero of Socialist Labour. Of course, it would mean fulfilling and over-fulfilling his production quotas, but that was nothing new. He had done it before. On the morning of the next day, March the 8th, the main regional newspaper published a photo of a smiling Brukhanov surrounded by other delegates to the Congress upon their return to Kiev. He looked reserved, perhaps a little tired, but generally happy and satisfied, a man in control of his destiny and that of the people around him.